and it's that time of week again for another episode of Neurodiversity with Theo Smith and all the lovely, wonderful people that come and join me on this podcast. Yes, I started this podcast because I wanted to elevate the voice of others, because I couldn't really find enough information 4 or 5 years ago about the topic of neurodiversity, especially from a strengths perspective, especially from looking at it in a positive context. There was just not enough information. So started this podcast all that time ago to enable you to hear those incredible stories from different people across the globe on this topic of neurodiversity. And today I'm joined by Kimberley, who's going to come and share her experiences, some of the work that she's done, some of her knowledge and insight, some of the barriers that she's faced from being dyspraxia. So Kimberley, would you like to introduce yourself to our audience today and let them know a little bit about you?
Hi Theo. So as you said, I also have dyspraxia. So yeah, a lot of our challenges, as you're aware, are very, very similar. So for people who don't know about dyspraxia, challenges, memory, concentration, coordination, it's very much individual. I have met people before who struggle very much with the more physical aspects, with the coordination, with, for example, cooking or buttoning small fastenings on clothes, etc. And then you have people who struggle more with the invisible aspects, like myself. So I am very much affected by the physical side of it, but with me it's more my concentration, my memory is far and above the where it comes out the most. So I don't really have a short-term memory, really, unfortunately. I tend to repeat myself a lot. I have to write everything down because I will not remember anything one day to the next. I tried to use a diary, but because of my memory problems, I tend to misplace that on a regular basis. So I find myself buying diaries at regular points throughout the year because I will have either put it in a safe place in the house, and well, you know what that means, I'm never going to find it again, or I'll put it in my bag and take it out when I'm out and about and I will leave it somewhere. Or yeah, so then I had the great idea last year to replace it with an iPad. My family thought, something that's more responsive would be a better idea. And I managed to take that out and lose it as well. So yeah, that was quite interesting. But in terms of when I was growing up, to start with, I was actually quite fortunate, really, because so where we lived when I was really young, it was the kids you'd grown up with, right? So they don't necessarily think anything's different about you. They just know you as you. And that was, they kind of just accepted, if you need Kimberly to go anywhere, you need to kind of grab her and drag her along, or she's not gonna she's not gonna follow you, because she'll have looked at that thing over there and got distracted, or she'll be thinking of something else and be standing and you're leaving her in the dust. But then when I was 10, we moved house, and as a result I had to move schools. And it was difficult, but being naive, I thought, it's another school, but it'll be okay. Well, so unbeknown to me, I was sent, I always said before, when asked this question, I was sent to run an errand. I was sent out of the class a couple of weeks after me and my sister had started at this school. So I'm 11 years old, right? So, at that age, you're not necessarily questioning a teacher. And I think you'll agree, as someone who's neurodiverse, you tend to either be a teacher's pet or you rebel. And I was definitely on the teacher's pet side. So I never questioned the teachers. And I was sent, as I said, I was sent out of the class to, as I said, I always said to everyone for years that I was sent out to run an errand. So they sent me out into the playground to feed birds at 11 years old. And I thought it was a bit strange, but I never questioned it, because you never do. And as I would only find out from my best friend many years later, they sent me out of the class and then proceeded to tell a class full of 11-year-olds that I had amnesia. So I'll let you make your own conclusion of how good an idea that was.
Wow. Yeah, and it's interesting because I was sent out of the class for all different other types of reasons, but certainly to do cooking when other kids were studying lessons, and that for me was about 9 years of age, being taken out of the classroom because, well, they would rather have you out of the classroom rather than in the classroom, which obviously is not a great thing when you're thinking about a young person's development and developing relationships and connections with their peers as well. When you get isolated from your peers, it is much more difficult to develop those connections. So I can only imagine how difficult that must have been to at that very age. I also transitioned to a different school about the age of 8 or 9, around that period of time, and then came back to my old school, which I found very difficult. So how do you think that impacted you, that change early on at that age of about 10, going into that environment that was very different, where teachers were making poor decisions, saying things about you? I imagine that had an impact on your sense of self-worth, how you fitted into that environment. Tell us a little bit about that.
Absolutely. So in my naivety, so I'm a reader, and if I fixate on something, I want to know all about it. But that's me now. Going back to that point, I only knew what I had been told, and we were told it was a type of brain damage, which of course we know now isn't the case, but I was basically just repeating what I'd heard from adults, from teachers, from outside sources. So if a kid would ask, I would say I had brain damage. But because the teachers had said I had amnesia, now I can't even remember if I had said I had brain damage, or if because the teacher had come out with the amnesia, if they had got to that conclusion all by themselves, and it became so ingrained that I started to think it came from me, which is possible. I mean, I think especially at that age, as you said, has a massive impact on how you see yourself. And for a very long time, I genuinely believed that I was stupid, that I was useless, that, if I could only function like other people, life would be better. If I functioned like this, I wouldn't get bullied. If I functioned like this, I would be able to do maths. I would be able to tie my shoes. I would be able to, just silly things. Like I would be able to play football. I would be able to, run around the gym, join the girls' netball team, all these things that you don't necessarily think about when you can do them. But when you can't, I think it really, as you said, it can sometimes feel like it's taking a bulldozer to your self-esteem. Absolutely.
Yeah, it certainly does. And I suppose it's reflective now upon those early years where some of that trauma and some of that stress can come out now, because at the time we may have just, like you said, you're not questioning it, you're just getting on with it. You're being told what to do. You're being told what's happened, even though that is not factually accurate. So all of these building blocks of misinformation, disinformation, I imagine that there is a point of realization. Where did the point of realization come for you, Kimberly, where you started to unpick some of those things that were not accurate, some of those things that perhaps did misguide you? What was the point of realization to go, actually, no, this is something else, and I'm going to explore that further? Was that earlier on in life, or is it more recently that you started to understand your neurological makeup and how it works?
Yeah. So when I was 16, so we were told, so when I received my diagnosis, this was when the term dyspraxia itself was quite new. So my diagnosis was actually motor learning difficulties, which, as we know now, is just a new name, an older name for the same thing. But we couldn't find anything about motor learning difficulties. We couldn't find any information at all. So this'll be kind of when, the internet started really taking off and all the rest of it. And I'll go back to this later, but I had landed in a dispute when I was away to go into college. And one of the things they said to us was, "Oh, we've never heard of this motor learning difficulties." And right, okay, that's fair enough. I'll give you some information. So I goes on to Google, types in motor learning difficulties, another name for dyspraxia. Okay, I've heard of that. So now I know what I'm dealing with. And so I'm similar now, but especially at that age, if I found a new term or something I was interested in, I needed to read about it. If I find something out, I will get all the books, I will read all the things. And the first book I ever read about dyspraxia was the self-titled one by Professor Kirby. And I read this book from cover to cover in, I think, about 2 days. And I followed that up with Caged in Chaos by Victoria Biggs. She, at that point, was 16. And I said to Mum, this is me. I said, I could have written this book. This is me. And so I had a name. I had sources. And okay, I'm not alone. There is other people out here who experience life the way I do. And that kind of led me down a rabbit hole for a while. But I was in my element. I'm researching and reading for, I think that lasted for about a year solid. But it was interesting to me because I was finally realizing why I was the way I was. And it was life-changing.
Incredible. And so from there on, when we think about dyspraxia, DCD, there's different terminologies, as you've mentioned there, dependent on, what the diagnosis was, when you got it, whether you benefit from a diagnosis at all. And up until now, whereas dyspraxia is being talked about a lot more, but still nowhere near as much as when we talk about autism, for example, or ADHD, or specifically dyslexia. Dyspraxia, I would say, is still something that often goes under the radar, and yet it co-occurs with other conditions or traits like autism or ADHD, for example. I also think it gets missed again because if it's not picked up in childhood, and you made a great example before, some of the ways that it impacts you is not perhaps as obvious, as visual, to perhaps the way it may impact some others. And we get back onto the concept of autism, for example, in girls, and it being missed because of the way that it shows up. So we're not that far away from the similar concept around what typically we may expect of dyspraxia, the little we may know, to the reality of how it impacts many people is not so obvious. And so as you've gone on that journey and started to explore what dyspraxia means to you and the terminology and how it impacts you. Where were some of the points in your life where you saw that life was creating barriers for you? You know, any examples of where you felt that workplaces could be adapted or changed, or the considerations that could be made by others? Just those key learning points that between the age of, I think, when you first started to consider it early on in later teens, right up until now. What do you think would be useful for people to hear listening around where the challenges can come into place for those like yourself who may be dyspraxic within a work environment?
So I think it kind of started to hit home a bit when I got to the later stages of school, there was no discussion of me staying on. It became abundantly clear they just wanted me out of the school because they didn't know what to do with me. But then I fought to get into college because as I said, they said to me they had no idea what this motor learning difficulties was, which led me to the dyspraxia diagnosis. But even with that, I still fought for a year to get into college because at that point, so one of the things I didn't learn until my late teens was road sense. So I have absolutely zero speed or depth perception, which meant around roads I was a hazard to myself because I would forget to look when I was crossing the road, and I would forget where a bus stop was. I didn't know how to read timetables, etc. But the college, because of that, to get into the course you want, you've got to be able to travel independently. And ironically, it was a course for those with learning difficulties. And it was like, but you're penalising me for something that is part of my disability, so how does that work? And I, at 16, sat down and wrote them a letter explaining my sentiments, although maybe not in a particularly nice manner, and handed it to my mum and dad and said, look, you're right, but we've got to kind of tone it down a bit. And so that took a year. And they came back and actually said to us, right, we will let you in, but you've got to learn how to travel. So my family ended up having to fund ourselves a course. So there was a local company which would actually teach neurodiverse people how to travel independently, because so many of us, struggle with a sense of safety, road sense, traveling independently, because we don't necessarily know where to catch a train or a bus. We don't know, where to get off the bus. We don't know, all these basic things that you wouldn't even think you would have to think about. But for me, it was one of those things, and still is to an extent, one of those things you have to think consciously about, because otherwise, you're going to end up in difficulty.
Yeah, and I think that transitions into the workplace, and I think there's some of the considerations that are not thought about. We now have a much better understanding of organisations making better adaptations. Universities have got much better at really thinking about this, thinking about signage, right? Because signage is a real problematic area.
Absolutely.
The amount of signs that are just, so it's hard enough to get to a place, but then to get into that place and to find your way around is so difficult, with arrows that look like they're pointing one way when they actually mean for you to go another way. The amount of times I've stood there thinking, does that mean like I need to go straight? Am I somehow I've got to go up? Do I need to go up the stairs? Or is that telling me to go? I'm like, oh, this is really difficult. And reading like walks when I'm looking at signals, and they never seem to explain the things that I see. They say, when you get to this section, you climb over that. But I'm like, but what about this section where I'm on now? This is an interesting place. I could turn left, I could turn right, I could go. And I think there's a real lack of consideration around the way that our minds might work in that environment, and that somebody thinks the description is sensible, but it is not sensible for, 1 in 10 of the rest of the population. And that becomes a big barrier to travel, but it
Yeah,
also becomes a big
definitely.
barrier to attending interviews. It also becomes a
Yes.
big barrier to going out and socializing. It also becomes a big
Absolutely.
barrier to getting home safely if you're a young person. You're not, like, there's so many layers to it. And
That
again, it is around the what's been built around us. It's often not that we can't get from A to B. It's that what's been created to support you getting from A to B is not created with us in mind.
yeah, absolutely. So when I started learning to travel on my own, if someone handed me directions, right, go left, go right, go straight, go this street, no, because for a start, unless I'm wearing a watch or rings, I can sometimes struggle with my left and right. I go by landmarks. So for example, your bus stop is next to McDonald's, or you know, get off next to the statue, etc. And as you said, there is absolutely no consideration for how a neurodiverse mind works, because we're, I have friends with various neurodiversities, and one thing we all have in common is that we struggle with left and right in a sense of direction. And for a company to say, like, oh, we're on so and so street, so you travel X amount of yards, then you turn left, then you turn right, then it doesn't make any sense, and it's just an extra barrier in your way. It's just something else you've got to consider on top of, as you will say, going into an unfamiliar situation and then just adding one more stress on top of another. And then by the time you reach your destination, you're so stressed that you can't concentrate on what you're actually away to do.
Absolutely. And so when we think about that, we've thought about that in terms of the journey from, I guess, academia, the challenges and barriers you faced even getting into college, and then once you did, some of the misunderstandings within that environment. What do we think about in terms of the experience doing jobs as well within the workplace? What are some of those barriers that you found and strengths that you've had that have made it difficult sometimes in the world of work, but also the strengths and the abilities? You've mentioned some around hyper focus and fixation when you're really interested in a topic. You read everything about it and you get to know it really well. And therefore that kind of insight and that knowledge, that depth within something that's really of interest to you. But also, where else within organisations, within roles, can people start to consider some of those challenges and some of those strengths? Any other examples that you can give us?
I mean, I think for me personally, until very, very recently, I was never given that chance, because as I said, when I went to college, so when I had went to college, so there was two avenues. You could either do retail or you could do hospitality. And there was never a choice. There was never an option that was end of discussion. If you were neurodiverse and you wound up on this course, that was it. And at that point, I wasn't confident with technology at all. So I just went towards the retail, which, looking back, I mean, had I actually known a bit more about my dyspraxia at the time and how that kind of environment can affect you, I mean, even from a sensory point of view, never mind anything else, I would have probably made a different decision.
Interestingly, I think a lot of people end up in, especially early on, I think this is one of the biggest problems that we have. Interesting your thoughts about it. often because we come out of school, we may have qualifications, we may not. We may go into college, we may do different types of studies. You know, I know for me, I did a DOVE, a Diploma of Vocational Education, and then I went on to do a BTEC National. I didn't end up coming out with any qualifications. Long story, but the reality is, you then go and take the jobs that are easiest to access. And those jobs are
Yes.
often in retail, they're in bars, they're in noisy environments, they're in chaotic environments. You have like long hours, you have very limited breaks. You know, there's like lots of challenges. And if you're not aware that these environments are doing something to your brain, right, that is leaving you completely exhausted,
Yeah.
overstimulated, then you don't understand the reasons why you may be struggling with that environment and having difficulties. And so that can be really problematic, I think, for many people transitioning from school or college into the workplace. Is the jobs that would be better for them are not always easily accessible for them. And
Yeah.
they don't have the advice to say to them at that stage, oh, I mean, I think we're getting a bit better, but we're still nowhere near to be able to say, oh, you're dyspraxic. How does that, what does that look like for you? How does it make you feel? When do you feel great? When do you feel like under pressure? Right. Being in this environment, like a retail environment, might not be the best for you.
Yeah,
Like,
absolutely.
actually,
Absolutely.
there's some other jobs that are similar in terms of pay scale and what have you, but they would be much better to go in that environment. And then the mechanisms to be able to support people into those environments don't exist well enough. We're seeing more with access to work in the UK, with funding and support from the government to help transition people into the right types of roles. But again, we're talking about a very small proportion of people who end up benefiting from that because there's still a
Yeah.
lack of knowledge. So I guess I'm preempting the fact that it's we end up, a lot of us, in these what can be very toxic spaces and places in terms
Yeah.
of our workplace experiences, not of our own doing. And
Yes.
somebody I interviewed once talked about it, the losers loop, because their dad was in prison, they ended up in prison, and it was like this losers loop that you just constantly got caught in and you could never get out of. I think there's something around that, around neurodivergence, that because we may not come out with the expected results, or because
Yes.
we're not normal in the context of what society deems normal, whatever that is, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
um, then it makes it really, really hard for us to find that space and place where we perform at our best. Now you've been able to extract yourself from that journey and experience that probably wasn't always benefiting your abilities. What's it felt like now to be able to write about this topic, talk about this topic, really start to lean into some of your strengths and really start to deal with some of the realities of some of the trauma and experiences that you've gone through to get to where you are today, to now advocate and support dyspraxia and the conversation around neurodiversity?
It's actually, I'm not exaggerating when I say it's been transformative. I and you'll be familiar with this, for a very long time I viewed my dyspraxia as the problem. If, you know, if things had been different, if I had been different, if I tried harder, if I just tried more. But actually, it's not that we're built wrong. It's not that we have, it's not that we're, certainly not that we're deficient. It's certainly not that we don't have skills, that we don't have intelligence, because we absolutely do. It's just because we face barrier after barrier after barrier. And I think when you're so used to having those barriers in your way, it gives you it gives you a determination, and it gives you a grit that few things do. I think if if it doesn't break you, it'll make you stronger.
Absolutely. The resilience I think it builds. Um, but only I think with the understanding, because without the understanding, sometimes there's still a risk that we fall off the edge of a cliff. We hear about, entrepreneurs doing exceptionally well, but at some point there's a breaking point because they still
Yeah.
didn't understand what cognitively was going on, and work themselves to a point of complete exhaustion, of burnout, right? Because they didn't recognize they could, the burning the candles at both ends eventually would
Yeah.
burn them out completely, which is fascinating. So what is it now that what is it that you want to do? What is it that you hope to see? What are your ambitions for the future? What is the focus for you now?
So my my focus now, I want to raise the profile of dyspraxia as much as I can, because I think where we are now with dyspraxia is kind of almost where we were with autism 5 years ago, where we were with dyslexia 10 or 15 years ago. I think it kind of goes through this cycles where different neurodiversities are brought into the light and kind of made more aware, which is brilliant because it means everyone gets to be understood, right? But I think there needs to be more talking about it. Absolutely, there needs to be more awareness of it in organizations and businesses. There needs to be more, I think, just people asking, oh, you have dyspraxia, I've never heard of it, can you tell me how it affects you? Can you tell me a bit more about what support you might need, what support I can give you, what would be helpful, rather than just kind of brushing it under the carpet.
Yeah, absolutely. And what would you say then to others? Because there's still going to be a lot of people who, one, don't understand dyspraxia. They've maybe never come into the contact with the term, which is now gets surprising, right, for us. But there will still be many people who just that has not come into their psyche. Yeah, they've not been. Nobody's discussed it with them. And somebody may think, oh, actually, there's some stuff that really resonates with me here. What would be your advice to people who maybe it's the first time they're coming into contact with it, but it resonates with them? What steps do you think those individuals can take?
Well, the way I'm in no way professionally trained. I'm not from any field like that. But first thing I would advise anybody to do, if you kind of have a light bulb moment and think this could maybe be me, read as much as you can. Go online. There are brilliant books, as I said, Dr. Kirby's book. There were some brilliant books by a woman called Mary Coley. There's another woman called Janet. I can't even remember her last name, but if you Google Janet and dyspraxia, she's got a brilliant blog. And that for me is when the lights started going off, because there was so much in there that resonated. And if you find what resonates, you can then, there are countless blogs on LinkedIn, Instagram, Facebook, there are support groups, and it'll just help you figure out this is why I struggle, this is how I struggle, and actually here's solutions for dealing with it. Because there are some brilliant pages where they have, loads of tips, especially pertaining to the short-term memory problems, which is what a lot of us struggle with, and how to work your way around it.
Yeah, I like to think of my brain as like a busy working memory rather than a poor or bad working memory.
Yes.
Because of the amount of stuff that's going through my head, it just makes it really difficult for me to retain like the bits of information that other people think I should retain. And I'm very visual, like you described. I'm thinking and seeing in images. That's why I really get if somebody's describing how to get somewhere that they're visually describing to me, it is much more useful. That's brilliant, thank you. And if people want to reach out and connect with you, Kimberly, what should they do? How should they be able to connect with you or learn from some of the work that you do?
So I am on LinkedIn. My profile is just Kimberly Fraser. I have got an Instagram that's currently under construction and should be up and running hopefully within the month if I can pull my finger out. And yeah, that for the moment is where I'm starting with, and then hopefully building from there.
Brilliant.
But that should give people enough information to be going on with.
Fantastic. Well, I very much appreciate you coming on and talking about what is absolutely an under-discussed topic as part of the whole piece around neurodiversity, neurodivergence, the neurodiversity movement. And yeah, it's a real pleasure to have you come on and share your experience and background and thoughts with us today.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it. Thank you.